Hajime!
Greetings, Legionaries. How are we doing today? Here we are situated in the Armenian mountain chain. I don't want to give my exact location. Obviously, OPSEC, Sergeant Barnes and I, here with some Legionaries, taking command, walking the perimeter, considering our movements, considering the world in the moment. Been doing a lot of reading regarding the evolution of military affairs. Been doing some research, speaking to some experts in that field, and of course it's always an aspect when emergent trends and technologies manifest different dynamics which culminates into a completely different terrain, technological terrain of warfare. Everything is thrown into disarray. And so, unfortunately, the narrowness of mind of the average human being, and I don't arrogate myself to be so wide-ranging and dynamic. You see, I may contain multitudes, but I am not a genius, a seminal mind that can synthesize all these disparate trends. The last time that we had such a, let's say, profound and cogent impact on warfare was the outbreak of World War I, the innovation of mechanization, and thereafter the integration of mechanized warfare, aviation, infantry, traditional arms, and so on, automatic weapons, radio communication, all into one cogent doctrine. First, proffered by B.H. Littleheart. He was a British captain of infantry who was fought and was wounded at the Battle of the Somme in France. And in his convalescence, because he was not able to sustain military service at the front line, he took the interwar years as an opportunity to do some reflection, to integrate these new emerging technologies and synthesize a more coherent whole. Now, of course, this was picked up by Guderian, and the Germans just took it and ran with it, right? They just took a leap of faith into this new revolution of warfare, headfirst. And in their proxy wars with Spain and so on, they were enormously successful. That was the paradigm of the future. The British Army still lagged behind, held on to that doctrine of positional warfare, but that's beside the point of what I'm trying to get at. Nowadays, in our time, we see all these weapon systems, information systems, heck, even the unspoken yet understood innovation of state, military, and civil integration into one whole of state effort in achieving, let's say, foreign and domestic interests. So it's basically one cohesive army, right? It's discipline, leadership. But just like I'm sure many of you know, technology fails. Just because right now there is the possibility where FPVs can be directionally negated via, let's say, radio waves or some kind of jamming, spoofing, EW capability of whatever kind, it doesn't mean that in the iteration of defense and offensive, this kind of dialectic in eras. So what I mean by this is, of course, first it was the innovation of the cannon, which gave basically the initiative back to the offensive, because the cannon as it was invented, ultimately laid low all those castle fixtures throughout Europe. And if you look at a map of basically a heat map, dots, where everywhere there's a castle from the medieval era, it is insane. And it caused a stagnation in warfare that ultimately hinged on a positional conflict of taking this castle and that castle and so on. And these siege affairs used to take years, months if you were lucky. But these cannons completely changed the battlefield. They laid low those walls, made it irrelevant, made fluid again mobility and march and countermarch and so on. Made decisive action happen more and more on the field of battle as opposed to a city-urban environment fight. The next evolution, of course, was the muskets, the mass production of muskets to a standard variance and holding rank and giving primacy to the infantry. Next, of course, it keeps on going. Industrial warfare, the logistics and innovation of logistics and communication, the integration of corps command and centralized planning, synchronization, and so on. And of course, all of this is innovating, going from periods of defense. For instance, World War I was a war that favored the defensive, right? So you had the mass proliferation of automatic weapons, machine guns, heavy machine guns, light machine guns, and you had heavy artillery. Both of these, especially with the technology of the time, with the lack of radio communications, by hand, favored the static defense. And then World War II, of course, with the advent of tanks, and you saw this at the very end of World War I, it retook the initiative of the aggressor, right? So the one who was on the attack had the initiative because he had mobility, he had the ability to make decisions, call things on the spots. It was a lot more fluid. Fast forward to today, and if you see the Russo-Ukrainian war and the various conflicts that we've seen with the U.S. Navy, with the Houthi rebels and so on, and the civil wars of the Middle East in general, we notice that the defensive has a significant advantage over the offensive forces. And the reason why is because basically indirect fires, ATGM missile systems, FPV drones, and also basically decentralized command and instant communication via phone or any medium basically gives the initiative to the defensive. It makes it very difficult to spot the enemy, to concentrate him, to isolate him, and to discover him before he discovers you in an ambuscade. It also heavily negates armored tanks, especially without trophy systems. Of course, they're trying to harden that. But what we're going to see in the future with drones of all kinds, maritime drones, terrestrial drones, obviously air drones and so on, UCAVs, what we're going to see is effectively the return of industrial offensives. So there is still the merit of the defense is favored, but now we will be a lot more emphatic about scales or economies of scale, industrial leveraging, and just mass proliferation and saturation of enemy targets in one direction, in the depth of the enemy rear, throughout the enemy defensive perimeter, and the line of contact. But, and here's what's on the horizon. I don't know, this is conjecture, but I can imagine the emphasis now will be to negate that. To negate drones, to negate communications, to negate all forms of electronics writ large. Whether it's some kind of, I don't know, maybe tangentially related to an EMP or something that permanently undermines electrical circuits of any kind of frame. And by the way, electrical circuits and computers have become so integrated in any airframe, even those that are basically manned, quote-unquote manned, that it would instantly become a paperweight, right? Whether it's the F-35 and so on. But what I see in the future is the risk of hacking or hacking into a system or out-of-the-loop spoofing, for instance, where we can give false targets which cause the drone to inflict fratricidal damage on their own units. I can see that. I can see the asymmetry in which some dude on a computer who's ostensibly a civilian is able to access either the weapon systems or the logistical tail of that weapon system and compromise it in either disabling, using it against the enemy, or what have you, right? And so ultimately, I do believe there's a future in which peer-to-peer conflict will mirror very much the battles of World War II, or even prior to that, more rudimentary. There will be no electronic devices, and everything will be man and his agency coming to grips with the enemy by bayonets and fire and maneuver and, basic kind of arithmetic and all that good stuff. Basically World War I tier. Core. Hardcore, right? Right, Legionaries? We like that. No, but in any case, what the point that I'm trying to make, and of course it's going to be updated, it's going to have, new analog technologies which allow for higher performance within the conditions of a negated electronic environment. But, and this is a big but, that hasn't happened yet. But, because it hasn't happened yet, ultimately there is no impulse, especially because of the conservative nature of the military-industrial complex writ large. There is no impulse or basically signal for its obviated need. We don't know if the enemy has the capability to render our advantage as it stands moot, right? And of course, we are way behind on the industrial element of logistically supplying cheap and easy to use FPVs, UCAVs, whatever have you. So, we're still in the early cycle of this, but as you can see, technology shifts incredibly fast and increasingly so as time goes on. And if trends hold, I believe this is something that will emerge in the immediate future. Not only will there be the negation of electronics, but there will be, in effect, a kind of Stone Age that we will have to come to grips with in the near future. So, in this environment of technology fails, what is the perennial truth? What is the perennial truth that holds true throughout politics, society, culture, and war? It's the individual human agent. That is to say, the human will. And his willingness, of course, his willingness to fight, kill, and die, and experience the whole suite of existential emotions, reactions, and actions. The art of meeting and understanding and leading men, of course, is leadership. And so without further ado, we come to the subject of discussion, because I believe that the future will belong to those who have the fundamentals down par excellence. It may be the case that one side or another might have a disproportionate amount of mass on their side. They might have technology on their side. They may have shock, surprise, etc. on their side. But the X factor, the factor that coheres all these let's say, metrics and categories of combat efficiency into one cogent whole is the human agent, the individual soldier, the will to pursue the mission ahead of them, and of course, the leader that takes them there. And going back to the 1950s. And the reason why I'm citing this specific manual is because I feel as though there's something that has been lost in basically the emotional understanding of fellow humans, psychological understanding of fellow humans, like an intuition that had once been more prominent because of the fact that humans, man in the West especially, used to associate in person far more often, and due to the fact that technology has advanced, it has atomized us, and therefore those reps, so to speak, those psychological reps, are no longer present, those pressures. And so, for me, I feel as though the leaders of the past had a much more intimate knowledge, intuitive, and I guess pronounced ability to really have that feel, that coup d'oeil, of men's hearts and how to mobilize them, how to understand them, their variants, archetypes, and so on, their fears and courage, and all this good stuff. And so this is why I wanted to go back, and we're reading FM 22 TAC 10 Leadership, and this is from the Department of the Army, and this was published in 1951, March 6. Ultimately, this comes as a cumulus of World War II experience and military experience hitherto, basically Korea. And I think there's just such a wealth of knowledge because the authors of this book themselves are battle-tested, bright, intelligent officers from an officer corps that back in the day, because remember, I don't know if I've told you guys this or not, but before, there used to be an IQ test to qualify for officership. And the bare minimum, for instance, for the Marine Corps to enter as an officer, to become commissioned as an officer, was 120 IQ. Minimum, right? Minimum. And there have been studies that show, through analysis of, obviously, data points and this and that and the other thing, but basically the median IQ over time trended downward, yes, but in its glory days, in that era that we are reading from, specifically that this document is born from, whose hands and minds created it, was literally 138, 140, 145 IQ in that bracket. So geniuses. And the irony is how simple this booklet is. A lot of people think intelligence creates these inscrutable and almost, how do you say, it's like basically puzzle palaces. Very complex, you wouldn't understand obscurity. And just like Nietzsche said, those who obscure muddy the waters to appear profound, and the reality is these people are shallow. True intelligence is a lot less about seeing the target over the horizon, though it is. Genius is also about distilling down to essential components to say as much as you can in as little cognitive effort as possible. This is why, coincidentally, Nietzsche is such a powerful and important thinker. You can keep on going back and read his aphorisms and discern and come up with, germinate new ideas, new understandings each time. That's why I keep on going back and forth through the anthology of his, different writings all the time, because it's always perceived from new waters. It's so dynamic this way. And in a similar way, obviously not to that pitch or degree, this document really stood out to me. I think it made a lot of difference for me a long time ago, and I think this is what we're going to start to do right now. So without further ado, I'm reading here from the Department of the Army. This is FM 22 TAC 10, Leadership. So first it goes into Chapter 1, Basic Concepts, right? So defining the features of a martial team, the parameters of the martial leadership context. So let's go through a few key phrases. And like I said, all of these are extremely brief, so they're extremely easy to read, hear, and understand. I will be linking the book the online edition for free in the transmission notes below, Legionaries. I highly recommend you pull that up and actually download it locally because it is invaluable. Alright, starting off. 1. Commander. A title of an officer in charge of a company, battery, or larger unit. Leader. A military person who possesses qualities necessary to direct others. Leadership. Leadership is the art of influencing human behavior, the ability to handle men. The techniques will vary depending on the size of the command, the types of men, the personality of the commander, and the particular situation. Leadership principle. A leadership principle is one of the fundamental rules, characteristics, traits, or policies which is applied by a leader to control or guide the actions of his subordinates. Leadership technique. A leadership technique is a method of applying leadership principles. Leadership trait. A leadership trait is a distinguishing personal quality that is helpful in the exercise of command. And they're going to distill this down further later in the book itself. I'm only going to read through the first very short 15 pages. It's very short, but it's incredibly dense, and we will proceed from here. So here's the second section, characteristics of leadership. The essential nature of leadership. The military profession has no monopoly on leadership. In every walk of life, in every industry, in every government, in every phase of human endeavor, there are leaders and there are followers. Progress and success are dependent upon the quality and efficacy of leadership. So, just to reiterate here, obviously, it's giving primacy to leadership itself. If you've noticed, it's giving the onus, or rather the emphasis, to the agent human being, the man, the legionary, the commander, to effectively not simply cohere his fellows in his unit that he's in charge of, but also himself, and that the space between defeat and victory is decided by him. And I genuinely believe this. And like I said before, it's leadership itself which actualizes combat efficiency and forms the axiomatic motor by which units actually act. It's by his example that they follow, by his imperatives that they pursue the mission, and ultimately by his discipline and sense of justice that keeps the cohesion and well-functioning of their morale and weapon systems in check. Moving on. The elements of leadership. Leadership is the art of influencing human behavior, the ability to handle men. The art of influencing behavior, the very essence of leadership, in turn involves understanding, analyzing, predicting, and controlling man's behavior. Also involved in successful leadership is the will to lead, together with the character which inspires confidence. Undoubtedly, there are certain inherent characteristics which may aid in the development of leadership. Yet there are assuredly certain men possessing desirable leadership traits who have never attained the stature of great leaders. Likewise, there are men deficient in certain of these traits who have attained this stature themselves. Any theory that leadership is solely inherited must be rejected. Leadership is intangible only to the extent that we make it so. Any reasonably intelligent, morally sound, forceful man, no matter how inexperienced, can become acquainted with the component elements of leadership. These elements may be studied, practiced, learned, and applied, just as any other human accomplishment may be learned and mastered. End quote. So let's just zoom out here and kind of reflect. The essence of leadership, and they detailed it specifically to its component parts. Effectively, when he says understanding, analyzing, predicting, and controlling man's behavior, He is emphasizing the leadership quality of psychological adeptness, right? Basically, to be a true understander of human emotions and subjective experience, their reactions, their habits, everything that is that liminal state we call consciousness. And both their abstract and conscious thought, regulating that, motivating by that, but also being able to penetrate down into their subconscious, understanding who they are as men. And this is where Nietzsche comes in, of course. And Nietzsche is important regardless of whether or not you ascribe to his philosophy. He does make very important observations in depth of the human animal, because he takes it as a prior that man, the concept of free will, doesn't exist. And I believe in free will, legionaries. You must too. However, what his greater point he was trying to make with that is that the subjective experience of his cognition, which he experienced himself, varied by the fluctuating health or duress of his physical body, the habits of effort versus basically being sedentary, and seeing the variance between the two. And unfortunately, Nietzsche, as a congenital issue, was born with basically recurring migraines, right? Basically almost, debilitating migraines to the point where he would lay in bed for days at a time, unable to get up, unable to do anything aside from literally vegetate. And of course, he had to medicate himself with opiates and everything else. And of course, a lot of his philosophy came about due to the fact he was searching for environments which best suited and raised the vitalistic pitch of his ailing body. And so he's a German, right? He's a Prussian extraction. Though his surname is Polish, he's a German. And, a genius, military man himself. Very interesting, served in the Franco-Prussian War, and became the youngest chaired member of the University of Bern as a philologist, all that good stuff. But as you know, altitude in the Alps, which are incredibly sharp, the air is incredibly thin, the light is incredibly dim, and for someone who had ocular degeneration and just absolutely crippling migraines recurring, which as time would progress, as his life progressed, became worse and worse, more frequent and more frequent over time. And so his journey was through modes of diet. For instance, he would experiment with diet, experiment with habits of exercise, experiment with physically moving to different climes and environments of terrain and architectural spaces, which is interesting because all this has a physiological effect. This is his thesis. And that ultimately, to understand a man's psychology, you have to understand his nature. And man is varied, right? Of course, we have archetypes of a type of person, but if you zoom out, of course, you have very distinct groups of ethnic peoples, and if you zoom in, the variance continues. But at the same time, you can also tell what a given physiology tells you about the character of that biological being. There is a truth to the pseudoscience of physiognomy. Back in the day, like back in, I think it was before 1912, it was taught as a discipline in, basically to young cadets and military institutions, the ability to read men before they even spoke to you. It was, in effect, a kind of heuristic key to understanding the personality types as portrayed by their facial features, their bodily type. So if you're shouldered and so on. And there's a truth to that. And it's not simply recursive, right? Just because you're scrawny and weak doesn't mean that the traits that you have are simply a result of how you're treated due to being short and weak or whatever. It's actually something inborn as well. And so facial symmetry indicates higher likelihood of intellectual prowess. The placement of your eyes, for instance, indicates spatial awareness, tracking of dynamic movements, spatial reasoning, and of course, you can go on and on and on. But the point, to bring it back to the FM, what I'm trying to say is the following: that to be a leader, you really have to deep dive into these various topics. You have to become a consummate understander of men. Hence why there's a utility to philosophy, especially existential philosophy. But if not existential philosophy, Xenophon and Aristotle. And then later, of course, you have to have experience. Some of you, especially, young junior officers and non-commissioned officers, are born introverts. And I totally understand that. But you cannot let your aversion to people and the effort it takes for you to engage with people be a barrier to your duty, a barrier to your excellence, your martial excellence. You need to have it as a personal dictum that you will go out and constantly engage with people. Do not allow yourself days off. Think of it as a gym. Make an effort to strike up conversations. Go out to the bars with your boys and flirt with chicks. Understand what works, what doesn't work. Women are actually very good because women have an uncanny ability to discern bullshit. And so a lot of leadership traits have to do with things such as command presence, confidence, initiative, inspiring confidence in others, right? And that dynamic will teach you a lot. And I know you guys are going to laugh, but I shit you not, hookers are probably the best. Strippers and hookers are probably the best people to understand male psychology. You go to them, you don't have to do anything. I'm not saying you solicit or anything, God forbid. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is just speak with them, have a good conversation. They are replete with stories. They're very interesting, but what makes their trade and them successful at their trade, their erotic trade, is not necessarily the physical, though of course that is part and parcel of their, their vocation. It is the erotic trip, right? And I don't know, for those of you who haven't gone to strip club or whatever, that's more than fine. But this is true throughout the perception of eroticism. So much about eroticism is about the story, the mythos, the pitch and yaw of feeling, teasing, enticing, hinting, overtly assaying someone, leading someone on, and spinning all this into a story which creates that sexual tension. That is the motor of true sexuality. And if I may say as an aside, a lot of the reason why the West has such a profound fertility but also cultural poverty is precisely the lack of focus / emphasis on the erotic. And I suppose that's something Anglophonic and Germanic cultures, well, not true, because Germany is incredibly rich in art and culture that's gestated from within, but I think this is something that is a character of Anglo-Saxon, specifically general culture. They don't generally produce their own culture with regularity, with the same regularity as, say, the Latins and the Germans and so on. This is, of course, not to deny the fact that they have great minds and so on, but I mean, as a world feeling, a zeit of this people, the zeit for these people is very much humdrum, practical, pragmatic, objective, empiricist, focused on the material, and this focus and this habituated focus over generations and cultural reinforcement deprives, especially even in the English language, which evolved as part of the scientific revolution, as part of the greater industrial revolution, evolved to a theory of mind which was completely geared to the material reality and which dismissed and disregarded to a large extent the spiritual. And obviously that can change. Nations are dynamic and they're fluid. Of course, they maintain an essential principle, and the English people have created great works such as Shakespeare and so on that are admired internationally. But as a people, as an individual, especially if you're an Anglo-Saxon, blonde boy, I love you by the way, what I'm trying to say is the following, is that there's a lack of emphasis in the culture and the frame of thought for you to intuitively pick up what other cultures naturally imbibe. And so the way that you can pursue some PME is by seeking out these individuals who are adept and masterful and use it as application every day to dream, right? And that's basically part and parcel of leadership, is to impart the dream or the self-confidence in the will to win beyond reason. And you'll see a lot of this, and this is why I believe in the will, this is why I believe in free will and agency, because there are so many times in history, especially military history, where a tiny minority of underarmed, outmatched, undersupplied units and forces take great risks and also ultimately conquer and triumph against great odds. A great example, of course, is Cortez, right? He arrives with a shore party, I think is roughly 30, and then later it swells to 113 total Spaniards from the peninsula. And through his guile and his ability, martial ability, he agglomerates to himself small tribes that are disaffected with the Aztec core. But the Aztecs outnumber even his indigenously reinforced component part or combat force. I think it's something like 10 to 1, sometimes hundreds to 1. But he wins at the end of the day. It's a testament to his leadership, his daring, the initiative, and so on, and his soldierly quality. But it is important that you remember this is why leadership is so important, because it is the absolute sublimation of the human experience and human agency mastered. Now returning. The second element, of course, of leadership is the will to lead. This is something that I believe is innate. This is a temperamental thing. Sometimes you are raised a certain way with expectations of you to don the mantle of leadership. And still others are forced into that position by happenstance and necessity. In the military, there will be many situations of that kind. And ultimately, there will be times where your command, your commander and your leadership in general, all the way down the ranks, have been either killed or wounded and are no longer combat effective. You have to step up. Jocko Willink calls this extreme ownership. But the best way to kind of intellectualize what I mean by the will to lead, it's not simply the will to say to someone, do this, do that, etc. It is a change of mindset. And what do I mean by this? Most people walk around in this life a product of their environment. They usually fit into a greater whole. The best way I like to describe this is the following: that mankind is usually divided between two types of people. Those who are tools and those who are hands, right? Some men may be hammers, others, they may be calculators, others may be this or that or the other thing. But true human agency is able to wield all these things and to orchestrate them in unison. towards their own ends, to their own principles themselves. And so ultimately, it's almost a phallic anima. It's the ability to look around oneself and have a, not aggressive in the way that, oh, I'm a tough guy, this kind of stuff. No, it's an assertive, and it's kind of a way to see yourself as making the world a reflection of yourself by entertaining matter, orienting yourself around matter, and reorienting matter to your will, and people as well that you're around, but also the physical environment and so on. So, in other words, it is taking an active rather than a reactive frame of mind. And this requires a lot of things, right? I mean, it requires a certain sense within yourself of self-worth. They call this amour propre, right? It's the Frenchoid way of saying self-love, self-worth, honor, pride. And unfortunately, in our society, which is still heavily Christian and latently Christian, even if someone is agnostic or no longer practices, they still basically adhere to the same cultural, ethical framework of humility. But remember, in the Bible, meekness is not servility. It is not to be supine. It's not to be, a little slave. What it means in the original translation, as it was mistranslated into English from the Septuagint, means well-balanced, temperate. Okay? So to know when to obey, when to command, when to be strong, when to relent, and so on, and to have the good judgment to decide between the two. That is precisely the dynamic you need to have, because ultimately you need to be able to trust and believe in yourself first. And if you don't believe in yourself, the way that you build up that internal confidence is by action. You will likely get into situations which are uncertain, where things are confusing, where you cannot get your bearing, where you're under immense pressure, whether it's enemy pressure or even, friendly pressure, whatever it may be, social pressure of some kind, especially in a kinetic environment. What I would say is the following: you have to engender within yourself a certain confidence in maxims and basically habituate yourself through exposure to circumstances of that kind. Good training, of course, will mimic the reality of the combat front or whatever effort that you may be doing in the civilian world. This carries over. Leadership. See, here's the thing. This is why military arts and sciences are actually the queen of all studies, because it's in war that is the unity of all human disciplines bound into one and tested at every level, constantly, relentlessly, without mercy. And so it is, here that we have to understand the following, is that basically you need to experience yourself and your team to conditions of friction and the fog of war and disorientation. And my rule of thumb, it's really funny. If you watch Rome BBC, there's this image where at the Battle of Philippi, the two armies meet. It's Augustus Caesar, Octavian as it were, Marcus Agrippa, and Mark Antony on one side. And then, of course, it's Cassius and Brutus on the other side. And the battle has already been enjoined. It's been hours, and the men are ragged. They're out of formation. They have no idea what's going on, and they can't tell if they're winning or losing. And, in this TV show, Octavian looks over to Mark Antony, and Mark Antony's just nonchalantly eating bread, very calm. And, Octavian, a little bit of a nervous guy, prissy a little bit. He's like, do you know what's going on? And Mark Antony's like, no idea. And so he just throws away his bread, and with a little quip, he says, when in doubt, attack, right? And this is a great kind of paradigm. In all seriousness, though, it is a very good paradigm, rule of thumb, when trying to develop unknowns. Whether it's figuring out what opportunities lie in your career field, whether, let's say, you are trying to discover new knowledge, whether you're trying to, let's say, develop the battlefield and get a better understanding, physical understanding, subconscious understanding of the disposition of forces and the dynamic of the battle itself, the tactical situation itself. And so when you attack, it's not only that you're probing in force, right? You're basically doing a reconnaissance in force, but you are also, as a leader, giving that same impulse of aggression to the men who see you do that. Men imitate. And this is true for everyone. And so, incumbent to the quality of the absolute leader, the competent leader, is one who is self-confident, confident in himself, conscious of his shortcomings, and is always willing to engage with and challenge the unknown, the dangerous, and put himself at the point of friction, which is precisely where the leader needs to be in general. But without further ado, let's keep on going on in the paragraph here. And the last part, of course, is inspires confidence. So these two are related, and the reason why it is the case that, let's say, inspiring confidence in a commander is important. There's this one time in Rommel's infantry attacks, he was in an outhouse, in a house, it was a bombed out house, that's right. It was a bombed out house with a roof that had been completely decapitated through sustained, artillery fires, and everything's pockmarked, and, the trench lines are just in front of the house, and the French are just literally 50 yards away. And he has the contingent that is rotated off the line into the house, laying around, searching for any scraps of food that may have been left over, blah, 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 trying to go to sleep. This was their rotation for rest. Again, another element of combat leadership that is important, to make sure that you're regenerating your forces, that you are rotating your forces from the line and giving them regular rest, and to sustain their ability to keep a high morale and high proficiency. I mean, sleep deprivation literally makes you dumber. Days at a time, it can actually incur brain damage. The psychological effect over time of sleepless nights on cognitive function is the equivalent of drinking half a bottle of vodka. It's like being intoxicated. It has that same level of impairing the cognitive function of your brain. So, as they were setting down to sleep, there came in another artillery barrage. And it was sporadic. It was designed to create tension and to deprive the frontline troops of the Germans of sleep. Who can sleep under an artillery barrage? And he saw that his men were unsettled and that they couldn't sleep. They were worried that they were going to catch a stray shell. And to be frank with you, you never know. It could be the case. Maybe there's a shell or a bullet or whatever it may be, a shard that has your name on it. You can't control it, especially at the point of contact. And ultimately, you have to have this positive confidence and appraisal of death to be willing to die. It's, as a Musashi, not to sound corny, it's a Musashi quote, right? It's the path of death, right? It's the embracing of death in the pursuit of honor, in the pursuit of the mission, in the pursuit of integrity. That's what sets the warrior or the soldier apart from the civilian and the slave. The slave is motivated by material circumstances. The slave's emotions and reactions are contingent and excused by his circumstances. He does not take ownership of self-control, of his emotional regulation. The warrior understands that it is his duty to have them under control, that it's demanded of him to be brave when one feels fear. And remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the presence of the feeling of fear and the act to overcome it. So regardless, Rommel understood that, he saw that, and what he decided to do was pop a squat on a chair that had been left over, leaned himself in the doorway of the front of the house, which again was facing the French 50 yards hence, and he fell silently asleep in a calm fashion. So behavior is contagious, and all the men around him started to fall asleep and get the rest that he needed them to get for his unit to have that kind of level of proficiency and get their recuperation in order and make them effective killers and soldiers of the front line. Confidence is not simply about also fearlessness and courage being the first virtue, but a whole bunch of different things that we'll get into later. But confidence, more than anything, is inspired by constancy. Constancy of good character. Constancy of good will, overpowering will. Constancy of good justice and ethical reasoning. Constancy of good judgment. Judgment to call the shots and see what is best, to be prudent, and so on. Constancy when everything is dissolving around you, the battle enjoined, the circumstance you find yourself in is hell, and you can look to your leader and see that he is stolid or calm and making the calls that he needs to make in a timely fashion, aggressively, but in a calm way, right? So he is doing things quickly, he is in the fight, he is energetic, and so on. Anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down because it's just one paragraph, and if you can see what I'm saying, and you should probably try to do this on your own time. Whenever you read, especially something that is a prose that has density, you should be thinking to yourself, especially if you're just reading to yourself, you should be thinking to yourself, how does this connect to what I know? Is there a connection here or there? What are some things that align with this? Where can I get more of this? Where have I read or heard that I could read more about this? And you should always have this as a background thought process, constantly going in your kind of orientation, OODA loop, psyche, as you read through any given document. Anyway, regardless, we go to the next paragraph here. It's going to be short. The leader and the small group. Every leader, whether civilian or military, actually maintains close personal contact with only a small group. Regardless of the number of men ultimately controlled by him, inevitably, he must depend upon that small group in order to make his will known and to execute his purpose. In the realm of the military, we refer to the small group as immediate subordinates and staff. So, in effect, what is this? Delegation. And Sun Tzu says, there's no difference between a small or a large army, it's a question of organization. And it bears out in psychological reality. Our brains are designed for a prehistoric, Paleolithic society where the maximum range of immediate tribal association is limited at 150, sometimes even larger than that, depending on your intelligence and your recall capability, so your memory. But in the mean, it's 150 to 100. And what does this indicate to you? If you're a divisional commander, right, you have 10,000 troops under you, you can't be, first of all, it would be silly to be individually ordering them, meat puppeting each and every one of these individuals. It's absurd. This is like trying to take down a cathedral brick by brick and messing with the bricks yourself. That's not how it works. Delegation of command is essential. You have to be comfortable with effectively giving chosen, picked men who, again, another quality of leadership is being able to pick other leaders, pick good talent for where they should be, right? Whether it's a combat leadership position or a logistical leadership position or so on. That is another element of leadership, which itself is essential to combat efficiency and the martial way of life, really. It's just being able to see a winner and put him in the right place and let him do his thing and give him everything he needs, support him in everything he needs to achieve that. And so the way that you cohere a large organization into intelligible and organized parts is by effectively delineating them by task and unit until there's a pyramid structure and you're able to affect your intent and convey your orders in a timely and persuasive manner. Because there's so much ahead of us, let's go to the next section here. Military leadership. Military leadership is the art of influencing and directing men to an assigned goal in such a way as to obtain their obedience, confidence, respect, and loyal cooperation. It is indispensable to success in combat. Like all leadership, it is dependent upon personality traits and upon the application of recognized techniques. The personal traits can be developed, and the techniques can be learned. So, just a small note here. The funny thing about leadership is, and I don't arrogate myself to be a magnificent leader in all this. In fact, I would say my upbringing, which was very diverse in the sense of moving all the time, military kid, going to different countries, experiencing different peoples, having to make new friends everywhere, and so on. But sports are probably the most essential elements of a child's upbringing. I think it's important that you emphasize and ensure that your children do sports of every kind, especially team sports. And now why? Because I had absolutely zero. Starting from being a kid, I was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, boxing, Muay Thai, competing. I was doing very well for myself, but I hadn't habituated or even frankly exposed myself to what it means to lead. What does it mean to be part of a team? What does it feel like to have your actions be valued as an aspect of the whole? How well do you work with others in creating and pursuing a shared goal? And I had none of that experience. And fun fact, I wanted to go in the military, and I realized I have no idea what the hell leadership is. And so this trait that had been, or I wouldn't even call it a trait. It's a propensity. It's like having muscles, right? It's like not working out until you're 20 or 21. I was extremely behind the curve, especially against my peers. Compared to my peers who are all chads, intelligent, freaking go-getters. They're amazing guys, and they have a long history of experience of teamwork. Many of them captains of their various teams and so on. My only experience with leadership, with evocative leadership, was, I suppose, political. And I was always a little rabble-rouser, especially as a kid, so I had some proclivity to it, but it was always a trait lay dormant. It was always a facility, maybe a higher pitched facility than most, but it was something that I had not cultivated. And so I took it upon myself to start to learn all this stuff from scratch. and is precisely my lack of proficiency and the necessity to truly do all the research and understand and really kind of hammer it home in my already aging mind, something completely alien and new, to master it by effort and experience and study. And this is why you need to be studying all the time. This is part and parcel. This is the reason why I created this project. It is effectively an outgrowth of that pursuit. The pursuit of understanding the military arts and sciences, the pursuit of understanding and mastering leadership, and it's a continuous thing. You can never drop back. Ultimately, you have to be constantly reading, gleaning the experiences of others, exposing yourself to circumstances which challenge your weaknesses, and so on and so forth. You should be constantly pushing yourself to the edge of your natural capacity and seeking to basically push that edge a little farther. Push your potential just a little more, you know? And that's really the only way that you will incur growth, is that idea of progressive overload. You have to constantly be on edge. You have to constantly go to the painful zone. This is why I keep on talking about run towards pain. All right, let's transition into the next section. Relationship between command and leadership. A. Authoritarian and persuasive leadership. There are two kinds of leadership, authoritarian and persuasive. One who is predominantly of the authoritarian type normally is recognized by dogmatic use of authority or power. The persuasive type, or leadership, takes into consideration the human element with all its complexity and with all its differentiation of the physical, mental, and moral capabilities and limitations of the individual. To a great extent, the persuasive leader bases his skill in leadership upon example and ability, with high standards of discipline and efficiency for himself as well as for his followers. This manual is concerned solely with the development of the persuasive type of leadership. Amen. Boom. So, just to give you reference for what is authoritarian leadership and what is persuasive leadership, this is not, this is not some liberal mental diarrhea. This is actually a real phenomenon that you should be aware of. And I guess it's more of like a tyrannical versus persuasive leadership. And so here's what I mean. So for instance, of course, the most important thing for the enlisted is, immediate and prompt obedience of orders, right? And what, this is paraphrasing. I'm not going to use the exact term, but what I'm trying to say is the following, is that, yes, we are trained as not simply like enlisted, but officers as well to, obey orders, to follow in good faith. That's another thing too. It's not simply exercise and execute the orders given from on high, but to believe in them. And to, if one is skeptical at first, to full-heartedly believe in them, and to, in good faith and with all your vigor, try and complete that mission set. But you also have to understand that for as much as that is the orientation in the military specifically, persuasive leadership is something that takes into account the fact that for as much as you are trained, for as much as you are someone who has that intent, there are moral and physical elements to the psychology of the person actuating those orders, right, given up from on high. And so, what makes the difference between a great leader and one who simply merely commands? Aside from being able to understand technically what should be done, it is also understanding the person receiving those orders that will allow those orders to be carried out, not simply successfully, but sometimes even beyond their original intent and exploit any opportunities which may come their way. One of the great movies that I recommend you Legionaries watch is this movie called Letters from Our Fathers, and it's filmed from the Japanese perspective about the defense of Iwo Jima, and it takes into account the experiences of various Japanese soldiers from different angles. And the Japanese are renowned for being a very, to command and obey. Their emphasis is in authoritarian leadership. The Bushido emphasizes this culture of embracing death and prompt and violent obedience to orders, even if it leads to certain death, right? Like, it's truly, and this is why, in the island hopping campaign, so much of the death and casualties incurred by the Japanese in that campaign wasn't actually caused by the initial or continuous tactical engagements with American forces. No. It actually happened because of the culminating event. As we know in ancient warfare, it is not the combat itself that is deadly, it is the rout. And the Japanese simply had no quit in them. And this is why I honor them. I think there's something beautiful in that they're able to embrace death over the perversion of cowardice and surrender. But, that leads them overall as a military organization to basically do the following: to completely lose a lot of experienced officers and enlisted, especially NCOs, who are essential, to basically being thrown away instead of recuperating, being brought back, cycled off the front line. They recuperate. They're used to create new units, to raise new units, and so that new unit isn't simply green. It comes with a lot of institutional knowledge proffered by the enlisted and officer leadership that would have been seasoned in previous conflicts and battles and campaigns of yesteryear, right? Of the same war. So that was a big mistake. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this, is that it was a film which showed the ineptitude of, and idiocy sometimes, of the authoritarian leadership type. There's a captain of Marines, like Japanese Marines, Imperial Japanese Marines, that was honorable, a good man, obviously he's forceful of will, but at the same time he was giving commands that were coming at the cost of a greater defense. And sometimes he chose it wantonly over choosing to displace and continue to fight elsewhere. It was almost like he sought martyrdom over over his mission success. He could have done better, right? And then, of course, there are a couple other guys who I fail to remember exactly what their position was, but same kind of dynamic. One of them was like a very mesquin type of dude who didn't know what he was doing, very propagandized. He was zealot. He kind of zealot, and very kind of crazy, not taking into account basic things like, yes, of course, you should train your men hard. You should push them hard so that way you're able to complete missions. But, then this is a big but, this shouldn't come at the cost of course, their welfare, being overexhausted, because you could push these guys hard and you could push them into the red, so to speak. But once you push them into the red, it takes a longer time to recover as a unit over time than it would be if you were cognizant of their water intake, of their rest, of their sleep, of their kind of also their circulation, right? So you're not just putting one unit to do all the foxhole digging and engineering efforts on the line. You're cycling them off. You're varying their activities and so on. And so there's all that. But then the Japanese commander of all the garrison forces of the Japanese in the defense on Iwo Jima was the inherent and exact opposite. He was a persuasive leader in this mold, in that he understood men, and he understood what motivated them. He had a kind of candor. There was a letter by Lejeune giving, I guess, guidance as far as how officers should treat their men, and both their officers' subordinates and also their enlisted, and they should treat them as if they're your sons. And the thing is, I think because in America it's such a broken place that we allowed the breakdown of the family. We have no reference for what a father is, especially because we come from such a gynocratic society that we exalt the woman and the mother, and we basically indict or persecute even the archetype of the father, right? Because it's patriarchy, you see. But you see, yes, of course, the role of a patriarch, the role of a father, is to push and have high standards for your children, but it's also with warm candor and understanding deep down, and of course, with the interest of seeing them live, right? You're not pushing your sons to death. You're not throwing their lives away at a whim. It's like the Oath of the Horatii, where if you look at a picture, it's a father giving his 3 sons their swords to defend Rome. And obviously the women are crying, but you can see in the expression of the father, if you look closely at the detail of his face, the sense of, obviously, resolution, self-sacrifice, because he's sacrificing his sons for his family and for his country. But at the same time, you can see a kind of melancholy and almost not regret, but sadness. That is the archetype of a leader. It's someone who knows what must be done, who cares for his men and seeks their well-being and their welfare, who pushes for the mission. And obviously the mission comes first, because remember, that father, the father of the Horatii, he still gave them the swords of the family, right? That's mission first. But I'm absolutely certain he set them up for success, i.e. via training, by moral encouragement, morale encouragement. When I say moral encouragement in this context, it means morale. It doesn't mean, be a good boy. No, that's not what I mean, okay? Regardless, moving on. The exercise of command. Command is the authority that a member of the military profession lawfully exerts over subordinates by virtue of his rank and assignment. Leadership can be exercised by anyone at any time, irrespective of the framework of command. It is recognized that in any group, some individual will emerge as the leader, even though no command or organizational structure is present. Individuals in coordinated capacities of exercising leadership in their dealing with equals outside the immediate command structure. In general, however, we think of military leadership as being exercised within the command framework. Therefore, in one sense, military leadership is the proper exercise of command. And so, this is true, right? Leadership exists regardless of official designation of leadership, right? And this is why we delineate between the two. Officially deputized archetypes of agency over a unit is a command. You have command, right? But at the same time, command and leadership may overlap, but they're not one and the same. You can exude leadership amongst equals, which is true. And I think Xenophon is a great example, right? Because the Greeks and the March of the 10,000 and their stories of hardship, trial, and tribulation trying to return back to their homeland is a story of equality, basically peerage and leadership amongst peers. Leadership amongst peers is the most hardest form of leadership you can imagine. And the reason why is because there is no underpinning lawful schematic to show one whether you should go, this way or that, and who is actually in charge. No one has a legitimate charge principle. Amongst the Greeks at this time, who were in effect elected / recognized Xenophon's natural ability and therefore sought his counsel, so much of their journey and their odyssey of returning home, the battles that they faced, the intrigue that they engaged in, a lot of it was delegated to Xenophon, who exuded this kind of leadership because of the fact that he was so naturally talented, naturally gifted, and also on top of that, trained in this theme of leadership, in this, I would say, it's like not discipline, but it's a, body of knowledge. It's this, it's not trade. It's something else. It's an art. Truly, it's really an art, and it's something that he had worked on himself, having been a pupil of Socrates, who focused on it. First of all, mastered himself, led himself, internally, over his baser emotions, and turned himself into a greater man. And that greatness itself revealed him to that host, and it's why he was chosen. Usually leadership is delegated to not simply the most competent, technically proficient person, but the most competent and who is able to combine that with that natural charisma or trained charisma and leadership intuition. Because it's not enough to be a leader. It's not enough to be very good at what you do, to give wise counsel, and to be, a genius of this or that pursuit of whatever you may be in. I mean, it doesn't even have to be the military. Let's go back to, let's say, The Office or whatever. Not The Office like the stupid sitcom. I'm talking about, if you're at research and development, let's say. You are a logistician or you're an engineer, what have you, especially amongst equals, people tend to delegate authority to one who is at least at parity with the best or close to that, but most importantly, who is able to mold people together, who has a natural magnetism. People want to be him. So for as much as you may think it's vanity, being handsome is important. Having that presence of aesthetic excellence. Really, it's an aesthetic standing out kind of thing. People enjoy that, but it can't be a foppishness, right? Military aesthetic is different from, let's say, being a model aesthetic. It's also about bearing and how you carry yourself, how you communicate, how well you articulate these ideas, how well you're able to instill a positive vision and moral drive in the hearts of those around you, or them, really, a leader, right? So it's this magnetism that amongst equals, a leader is chosen. And forget what you have been brainwashed to think by our liberal programming. All men choose leaders. All men are men precisely because we're not individuals. We are individuated parts of a whole. And everywhere we go, we seek and orient around that central axis of leadership. Basically, it is ruled by the best, self-evidently. Pericles was one such figure who, in a democracy where everyone's equal, he managed to exercise almost kingly authority over Athenians, even though it was a democratic state at his time, and lead them from victory to victory, because of the fact that he was so magnetic and such a force of political and military will and good judgment
and far-seeing, unlike the democratic ethos, which unfortunately also cut him from under, it cut his heels as well. It killed a number of competent and successful generals as well for very stupid and absurd self-defeating reasons. This is why democracy is absolutely absurd. It's the rule by the rabble, the idiots and the morons, people who must be commanded, not listened to per se. Like, they shouldn't be delegated any modicum of power, but they should have their welfare in the mind's eye of their leader who commands them. But yeah, democracy always leads to this kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So, regardless, keep on going. Accompaniments of command. Command in the Army is accompanied by a responsibility involving special trust and confidence. Command, with its ramifications of administration, planning, executing, supervising, and coordinating, is the primary reason for the military leader's existence. The leader is responsible not only for initiating action, but for supervising all activities within his command. In this responsibility for the general administration of a group, it is his duty to receive, comply with, and execute instructions with exactness and thoroughness, regardless of his personal feelings. So, this is something that's really important, right? This is an element of command. Command has certain intrinsic responsibilities and duties that otherwise leadership might not have. So leadership, the way I would like to see it, is kind of, if it arises organically, leadership is belief in the spirit of the law, the higher law, right? And command is basically not an abstract, it is a hard fact that you are given this thing by this piece of paper, by this guy in this organization, with these along these parameters, which give you a left and right lateral limit, that also give you an intent, that give you standards of compliance and obedience, and also, of course, foist you with all those powers that a commander is given, which is, of course, discipline, basically the authority to command and give orders within the parameters legislated and delegated to him officially. So it's like the letter of the law. And all these things are important, especially in the military arts and sciences. Specifically for an officer, you have to know things like administration, planning, executing, supervising, coordinating. Many of these things, logistical considerations, strategic conceptions, everything in, justice, for instance. The commander actually has to be a judge. I'm not even joking. It's you're responsible for the good order and discipline of your unit, and therefore, sometimes there needs to be effectively kind of a judicial role for the commander. And as we know, we have in the military, we have both military tribunals, we have official courts, we have things that are less, let's say, juridical than an official court. We have things like non-judicial punishment for minor infractions. We used to have corporal punishment before we became all fake and lame and liberal. I do believe in corporal punishment as a form of military discipline, considering if it's a minor infraction, and nothing crazy, not like lashes or something, because I think that can really harm you long term. But I don't know. A lot of you NCOs out there, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the wood line, Anyway, I don't want to get into it too deep, but all these considerations are fields of study you need to master and constantly pursue, constantly hone yourself in mastery of. And I may in the future actually kind of do deep dives into this just to give you exposure to these documents, especially the doctrinal documents of whatever. So here's the thing, if you're listening to this, Legionaries, and you're in the military or considering going into the military, you should be reading those doctrinal publishings. And it's not stupid. They may seem very basic and sometimes really dry, but it's important to read them. And where it becomes interesting, bear in mind, this is where it becomes interesting for those of you who are in the military trying to go in, is leveraging those doctrinal publishings and comparing them with military history that you read in general, or personal, let's say, biographies or experiences of certain battles. Like, for instance, Anthony Beauvoir is a great military historian, and he writes about everything from the Spanish Civil War to specific operations and battles of World War II, and you're able to overlay and see the discrepancies between where, for instance, in the Battle of the Bulge, Anthony Beauvoir talks about how the Germans made a failure because they didn't attack simultaneously. They always attacked along one axis at a time. And you're able to leverage your knowledge in the doctrinal publishings to understand how that was a mistake. I mean, there are a lot of intelligent guys in basically the command staff that take the time to write this stuff down. They're usually they're select officers. They're the best. And that's who is charged with the responsibility of writing these things. I mean, these guys, these doctrinal publishings are not written by idiots. And for as much as it's the case that in our time, generally speaking, the general officers, and I would say 45% of the field grade officers are morons, and they're only there because they're political appointees and they're deep reds and stuff like that, like as in communists. They are intelligent, and never underestimate their acuity of mind and their ability to analyze things. They're just servile. That is the difference, and are inimical to American interests, of course. But you should never underestimate the enemy. In fact, here's another thing, too, that really kind of ticks me off. A lot of people automatically write off the intellectual production or cultural production of a society that they are inherently antipathetic with. Like they don't like, for instance, let's say the Russians, right? Russia is a recurring theme in this. You may dislike the Russians. You may hate them. You may have personal, ethnic, revenge against them because you're that guy that, you came from that place, and now you're kind of running things here in America, and you really hate the Russians because they're Cossacks, you see? They were mean to me for no reason. Yeah, no reason. Yeah, okay. But regardless, it doesn't matter. You listen to them. You listen to them at what they're good at. And what are the Russians good at? Well, a lot of things. In the Cold War is propulsion technology, quiet propulsion technology. They were good at some technical fields that we weren't. Very few, though. In the military arts and their military culture, they are good at some things. Look at how far they're able to push their advantage over us. I mean, this is a country with the economy the size of Italy. What is the difference? It's their willpower. It's their cultural knowledge of self-sacrifice habituated into the martial culture. Their understanding of leadership. There's something there, right? And of course it's the case there are many faults. I mean, obviously they suffer from them. They're very sclerotic, slow to adapt. They are very top-down in a bad way. And of course I always make the case for top-down kind of leadership and command. But they take it too far sometimes, and it prevents knowledge and experience and feedback from flowing up the chain of command, so that the chain of command can make, let's say, informed decisions, and they're hesitant to delegate power and authority because of fear of mutiny or their inability to trust their constituent leaders to act on the objectives they have in mind. But, like I said, they have a lot of interesting things, such as their officer corps is expected to be proficient in everything that an officer is expected to be proficient in, and everything they're enlisted are supposed to be good at as well. So an officer is not simply an officer who studies strategy, who studies all those things, administration, command, planning, executing, supervising, coordinating, basic leadership, but also they're expected to know all the weapon systems of their constituent bodies, how these weapon systems and the agent behind them, so if you're a rifleman, or if you're part of an AT team, or if you're a mortarman, he is expected to know everything. He's expected to be able to train enlisted as well, to be so proficient that he's actually an instructor. So there's a higher standard that they're being set to, and I fear for the declining standards of the military. I believe Hegseth is doing away with the DEI aberration, which is certainly undermining our competence, in especially our officer corps, because we're so focused on these weird communist programs that we don't select for the best. We select for whoever who is the best of the worst because of either their gender or race or whatever. It's like, no, you need to be picking for the best, regardless, no matter how it shakes out, of patriots who are loyal to America and who are competent and bright individuals. So, anyway, continuing on. So next section, objective of military leadership. The objective of military leadership is creation and maintenance of an organization which will loyally and willingly accomplish any reasonable task assigned or indicated and will initiate suitable action in the absence of orders. The proper application of the principles of leadership to a command can create an efficient, well-disciplined organization possessing high morale and esprit de corps. So, long story short, military leadership is not simply about your personal wherewithal of what you do, but in laying your imminent anima, right, your imminent attitudes into the greater unit, which emphasizes aggression and bias for action, as well as, of course, self-respect, self-love. And this is done by a couple of examples. So, for instance, Colonel Hackworth, great man. I highly recommend you read his book. It is absolutely essential. If I could choose to show you one book, if you're starting out, for a great example of both leadership and personal experience of what it's like to fight in a conventional setting, what it's like to soldier correctly, the odyssey of his career is amazing. An exceptional individual. And what I mean by that is, for instance, when he went to Korea, he transmuted his ragtag bunch of individuals, right? Just an average line command. And what he did was he recast them. He recast what was otherwise a line unit into seeing itself as elite with a designed, like a designated, let's say, a designated identity, right? A central standard. And I mean like a physical standard. Like they had I think it was Wolverines or something like that. I can't recall exactly the title of that specific unit that he made his company into, but basically he made them so successful that the Central Command peeled them off the line and charged him with basically doing more of that. And they wanted to use him as a kind of tier 1 or whatever unit amongst the conventional forces on the line at Korea. And it was important because this self-love is important because when you have something beyond you, especially as a community, right, as a tribe, if you're part of an elite unit, it's not simply that you aspire to be elite, is that everyone around you is imposing elite expectations, and it bleeds into the general zeitgeist of peer pressure. The reason why people in America are losers is because it has a loser culture. If we're able to show America as elite and not be permissive with each other, right, to have low standards, you would see often men become either inspired enough to act in the way that is designed. For instance, in this case, Hackworth instilled a bias for action, for courage, for selflessness, for daring, and they became all those things. But at the same time, it was a successful exercise in creating men who believed in it, who did it, and anyone who did not was pressured into doing it. And so it became that. So it's a very interesting social technology that you should be aware of, in which when you instill a sense of a supra-individual identity, a tribe, and if you are casting it, you cast that individual identity imbued with the themes that you need them to be. That is leadership. That is command culture. Instilling that command culture is incumbent upon the leader, right? And ultimately, the men subordinate to you, or whoever you're subordinate to, you often are under the influence of that leader's personal both virtues and vices, right? And a good leader will know, obviously, where their shortcomings are and where their capabilities are. And they'll make every attempt constantly to mitigate their shortcomings and to accentuate their competencies. And wherever they are lacking, they'll be honest, and they'll be, not proud. They will be humble enough to delegate those elements to subordinates, and while still retaining, of course, the legitimating principle of leadership, right? So you can't be seen to be weak or incompetent, but if you do it right, and this is about judgment, right? Like, you have to have the good judgment to understand what would be accepted as principled delegation of things without seeming incompetent. And usually, honesty is the best policy. And if you're able to do that and selflessly keep that, that'll be perfect for you. I mean, Jocko Willing talks about this all the time, that, you should be, you should be always leveraging your subordinates' intelligence, and you should be leveraging their plans and their guidance in your mission command, precisely because that is the thing. It basically will cause your men to come up with the ideas, self-perpetuating themselves, delegating command, right? While retaining a unity of authority. Anyway, going on. Responsibilities of leadership. General. The responsibilities of the leader are twofold: accomplishment of the mission and the fulfillment of his responsibilities to his men. Man is the fundamental instrument of war. Other instruments may change, new weapons may be created, and new modes of defense may be devised. But man, the fundamental instrument, remains constant. The leader must be concerned with the desires, needs, and mental state of his men. If the leader knows and understands certain basic principles of human behavior, if he appreciates that most men react in fixed and definite ways under a given stimulus or influence, if he recognizes, develops, and applies those traits of character which will produce the correct reactions in his men, he will possess the basic tools for managing them. He will be a leader. Since effective leadership in battle is the ultimate goal of military leadership,
It is obvious that, regardless of the leader's ability to dominate or persuade, his success inevitably depends upon his skill in the tactical control of his unit. Tactical control is a technique developed by study and by practice." End quote. And so to reiterate, to go back to the point I had originally laid out in the beginning of the transmission, the point about how warfare may develop, may evolve, it may change, may be even more abstract than we currently understand it. But it will always center around the human individual who exercises agency. And I can make this claim, this broad claim, though the form by which this happens changes because of the fact that ultimately the political revolves around the human being, right? Because it is from the human itself that generates the political imperative. And further, it is not a given that technology won't advance to the point in which it's the case that, for instance, EW will advance and likely communications between drones and so on could be negated, right, in that circumstance. And so therefore, it is always imperative that there is a human person doing the analog technology of warfare itself. This bears out in every circumstance, in every way, at every time. To be frank with you, the day that war happens completely without human interaction is likely the day that humans don't exist at all. Frankly. I'll keep it there for now, because we're nearing the end of this chapter, and that's where I'll end this transmission. But let's continue on. Accomplishment of the mission. The primary duty of the leader is to accomplish his assigned mission. Everything else, even the welfare of his men, is subordinate. Now, there's a lot of pushback, especially amongst us moderns, where we think so much about zero defect mentality. There will be no incidences of death. They will be mitigated. Especially, this is a bad implication from the war we had in GWAT, which was, frankly, not a war with few exceptions. Generally speaking, it was a police action, gendarmerie. And we accustomed ourselves to a dynamic in which we went to this thing called war and experienced, comparatively, over 20 years, very few casualties. Now contrast that with the war in Ukraine. Do you believe that it's the case that we can pamper and consider, let's say, the mortality of men to be superior to the objectives war is trying to accomplish? Do you believe that it is integral to the war ethos to value life so highly as to abandon the principle for which war is being waged? I don't believe so. Obviously, this will be pushed back a lot, and you shouldn't throw away men like, let's say, the Soviets used to do in waves and so on. But that is the calling of the warrior, the soldier. There's a reason why it's called sacrifice. Beyond being maimed, it is also the embrace of death for a higher principle. Hence why morale is so important. Hence why it is so important to elucidate as to why you are fighting. The objective for which you're fighting must be clear. On a strategic level, on a national level, on your tactical level, your operational level, things must make sense. It must be worth dying for. Otherwise, it'll be nearly impossible to positively motivate men to achieve the objective, which, to be frank with you, induced, or rather, not induced, but motivated, self-motivated men and morale is far superior to coerced and imposed discipline and basically herding people into the line of fire. That is not where you want to be. That is last case, break glass in a case of emergency scenario, which happens sometimes, but that shouldn't be the default mode. That should be an extreme circumstance. But anyway, moving on. Duties to the men. The next responsibility of the leader lies in his duty to his men. It is rarely possible to accomplish any mission without attention to the morale and esprit of the men. In military service, the follower is peculiarly dependent upon his leader. He can do little to improve his lot if his leader neglects him. I mean, this goes without saying, huh? I'm going to keep on going now. So, Section 6, Indications of Military Leadership. There are 4 characteristics of command that are accurate indications of success or failure in the exercise of leadership. These qualities are discipline, morale, esprit de corps, and a degree of efficiency. So, I'm not going to read the entire sections of each because I don't want to take longer than I'm supposed to. Sergeant Barnes is glaring at me. We should be drinking and checking up on the men, but let's go back here, right? So first, discipline. I think that's self-explanatory. It's not simply a case of listening and obeying orders in good faith and executing them in a timely and correct manner, but it's also the basic things. Self-discipline, discipline shaving, discipline in maintaining your gear, your weapon most of all, and everything else. Discipline in emotional regulation, self-regulation, all the way down to the individual level. That's discipline. Now, morale. I'm going to read this because I think it's salient enough to actually read it off. Morale is a mental and emotional state. The importance of morale cannot be overestimated since it is a great contributing factor to the efficiency of a unit. Good morale is indicated by 1. Zeal, or the voluntary effort to which men give to their tasks over and beyond the perfunctory obedience to commands and regulations. 2. A basic sense of personal worth founded on the confidence in leaders, training, weapons, and equipment. And 3. Satisfaction, or the pride of the individual in the accomplishment of the assigned mission. So morale is a very interesting mechanism, and zeal is a good way of saying, an old-timey way of saying aggression. You want these individuals to be pursuing their jobs aggressively beyond the bare minimum. Meeting the minimum standards is unacceptable. The idea is that you want to give a minimum standard, a standard to which people are held to, but with the expectation of them pursuing even more than simply that. Taking the fight to the enemy, exploiting weaknesses, improving on things themselves, taking the initiative in every sense, whether in garrison or in the field. Of course, number 2 is like self-pride, the basic sense of personal worth, and satisfaction, of course, is basically not simply having pride of the individual accomplishing assigned missions, but also recognizing them as a leader, to recognize especially key performers who are doing so. The more that you are able to recognize amongst your men who is achieving highly, and you decorate them and recognize them, the more it encourages others to also apply themselves to reach the same level. You know, Napoleon would say that I can pay, I think, a soldier 50 sous a day, but they will die for the ribbon, a little piece of cloth on their chest. And though this may seem cynical, it's true, because ultimately it's not a piece of cloth. It's a sense of pride and honor, not simply in front of someone so, let's say, majestic as a commander such as great Napoleon, but amongst your peers and your brothers in arms. That goes a long way too, considering the fact that soldiery is an honor culture, right? So there's a comparative element of success and distinction which men seek to perform. Let's see, going on here. Esprit de corps. Esprit de corps is the mental and emotional state of the unit. It is distinguished from morale, which is described as the mental and emotional state of the individual. Esprit de corps is not a simple summation of the morale of the individuals in the unit. Rather, it results from the total interaction of the personnel of the unit toward one another and with the circumstances in which the unit is placed. When unit esprit is high, the collective goals of the unit overshadow those of the individual members. In such instances, the personal dissatisfactions of some individuals are overshadowed by the prevailing group spirit. Unit achievement, both past and present, is a strong force in raising esprit de corps. A unit with a high esprit de corps can accomplish its mission in spite of seemingly insurmountable odds. Esprit de corps is enhanced when the group identification is increased, and conversely, is lowered when it is decreased. It has been proved that pride in the unit was outstanding manifestation of good morale in World War II. This was accompanied by good officer enlisted personnel relationships. So yeah, I think this is self-explanatory in the sense that if you're part of an elite unit, you act in an elite manner. And this bears out also in historical case studies in which it's not necessarily that you are designated and recruited as an elite unit, but if you have a self-understanding of a greater whole which merits eliteness, you as an individual also start to act in such a way that is commensurate with that. But I already elucidated on that previously, so I won't keep you posted here. Finally, efficiency. Efficiency is the ability to accomplish successfully an assigned task in the shortest possible time, the minimum expenditure of means, and with the least possible confusion. Efficiency in a command is built by the sound training and by effective administration. It is enhanced by good discipline, high morale, and esprit de corps. So efficiency is interesting because so much of war is seen as wasteful. There sure is a lot of time spent, especially with inexperienced or people who arrogate themselves to be tactical or operational geniuses, to have a very complex, multi-domain fairy tale existence. But due to the dynamic of war being chaotic, it's the case that the simplest plans, with the simplest amount of moves, or the fewest amount of moves, that are most easily conveyed, are the ones that usually are most successful. This is why Patton says, a good plan violently acted now is better than a perfect plan next week. A lot of this has to do with basically an operational understanding of good enough is better, especially in the highly kinetic and mercurial environment of warfare, which is a dynamic and changing environment as well. So efficiency is everything. And to also not be wasteful, but that goes without saying. And finally, of course, we had the last section. Role of ethics. Ethics, the science of moral duty, is closely allied with the art of leadership. In order to set the example for his men and to win their confidence and respect, the leader must be capable of deciding whether a given course of action is morally right or wrong. A knowledge of ethics will materially assist the leader in making such a decision. It will ensure against his losing stature in the eyes of his command by embarking upon a course of action that is contrary to moral principles. Temporizing with principles and moral standards may secure temporary advantage or fleeting popularity. But in the end, only strict adherence to high standards of honor and integrity will prove of value to the leader. So ultimately, this is self-evident in a lot of ways. The code of ethics may vary from nation to nation, and even within the units and branches in which the nomos imposed standards are exercised. For instance, some things which may be morally acceptable in the militaries of different countries are not in ours, and it depends on the nationality and cultural makeup of the unit's men. But there are recurring things which are universal principles which are highly prized, and this is of course the equal distribution of culpability, which is to say ownership of mistakes. Usually leaders are held to very high scrutiny, and men usually look at them for any given defect or fault, especially in cases in which there seems to be hypocrisy. That erodes a lot of confidence in the command in general. And so ethics is not just this let's get ethical. It's not this HR conception of what ethics is. That's an aberration. That's a lie. That is a mendacity. Don't listen to that. What ethics is, more than anything, is a code of honor. It's a code of justice. It's to treat men equally in the sense of before the discipline, before the eyes of justice itself, in the kind of big J sense, the goddess. This matters, especially if it's the case that, for instance, your boss or your commander is hard on you, but he also does not train, or he's a spotlight performer, this or that or the other thing. For instance, remember from the Band of Brothers movie series, the Captain Sobel, that was his name. How, and if you read the book, it's even worse, but basically, he was a flat-footed, basically a very effete man who expected his men to do far more than he did, who would go out on the weekends on leave, while having basically rejected the leave of his company. That is probably the worst archetype imaginable for what I'm talking about. Is the antithesis of an ethical leader with no honor. And he ruled over that company as if they were his personal slaves, as if they were his personal slave cadre, retainer, bodyguard, so to speak. That is the antithesis of that. And then, of course, you look at Major Winters, right? And you see how he conducts himself to the highest standards of personal honor and integrity, his even-handedness, his firmness, and most of all, his ability to take ownership, to make mistakes, and to own up to it. But without further ado, Legionaries, this is the end of this chapter, and we are progressing far too long. Suffice it to say that I highly recommend you consult this book. It's very short. It's 30 pages. We only got 10 pages in. But it is inestimable in its value, and it should be the case. I may actually revisit this manual for a second transmission. However, what you should be doing, especially as a military professional, as a scholar of war, every time you read a book of whatever it may be, tangential or directly related to the practice of war, you should always be considering, especially when it comes to topics that come up from field manuals, right? Doctrinal publishing. A lot of this is the most condensed form of this knowledge. And so you shouldn't simply read passively. The way that you should engage with this literature is to first read it through once, passively, just open your mind and just allow it to happen. Obviously engage with it as much as you can. But what you should do is go back and then, for instance, we go here and I go to, let's say, authoritarian and persuasive leadership section. What does this mean? Right? Obviously they surmised what this means, and maybe you think that's sufficient, but it's not. It is important, especially if you have a passion for these things. You should, by the way, you should have a passion for command. You should have a passion for soldiery and the martial ethos. This should be a consuming thing for you, an obsession. And if you're obsessed, what you will do is consider these things, and you look them up. And the wonderful internet exists, but you should also consult others and ask them about their opinion and engage in this dialectic. And then the third time through, so after you've done this in detail for each section, you should also question these things, right? So for instance, the contentious part where I said, and I abetted this idea, for instance, that the mission is first, right? Mission first, men second. That is a contentious issue. That's like not something that most people would say. You should be able to flesh out both sides of that argument. This makes you a more well-rounded, a cognizant individual. It gives you a better understanding. It needs to be you need to be a great thinker, and one of the worst manifestations that happen naturally from the military type of character is this propensity to repeat phrases and words which are in doctrine, but not really engage with the greater idea, that what it really means. What is duty? You say duty and discipline, but what does that mean? Can you explain it? Can you explain it to others? And then, of course, can you flesh it out? Can you give examples? Could you find contradictions in what you're saying? Could you do X, Y, or Z? That is true understanding, and that is something worth endless time and effort and endless research and time. And so ultimately, the military profession hinges a lot on education, self-education. And what I mean by that, the most important field of study for military professionals is military history, psychology, doctrine, of course, to a large extent, your tactical responsibilities of your job, your vocation within the military engine and sphere, but you should be continuously keeping yourself appraised, relentlessly exposing yourself to this knowledge and engaging with it as much as possible, because it is the case that, in contrast to civilian jobs and experiences, it is the case that war is a relatively rare occurrence. It is something which is unique every time it happens. The dynamics are unique even between different seasons of it, and therefore it's very difficult to get hands-on experience from it in real life. This is why training needs to be realistic. This is why it's important to push yourself hard, and also this is why military leadership is so essential, or rather military history is so essential, because ultimately it's military history which will confer to you knowledge and expertise hard fought for in past soldiers' experience. But again, remember, don't confuse book learning with true knowing. It's one thing to know in an abstract what these things are. It's quite another to apply these things as principles in reality and integrating it into your body at such a level in which it becomes subconscious action. This is why reading is essential, because at least it forms the preliminary pathways in your brain that will allow you to conduct yourself in such a way which is commensurate with your training and your intent. This is why it's not enough just to simply know the minimum. You must continuously hone this thing. It's just like drill. You need to be so, like for instance, gun drills. You need to be so good at this thing that it doesn't take you any time to do it. Your hands just simply float through the motions and achieve it. Well, regardless, Legionaries, without further ado, I have to make the rounds, check up on the equipment, the men, and this is Sergeant Barnes, General Lance, Agonia, signing off.